Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, thousands of Israeli students and school staff re-enter quarantine amidst a recent spike in COVID infections. Israeli officials argue over the best way to save the economy, and a gorgeous new Israeli children's book gives us a reason to feel pride. Just 48 hours passed since Prime Minister Netanyahu called on Israelis to go back to social distancing, saying that the next few days would be a test. Yet more and more Israelis are still returning to their daily routines amidst a massive new spike in COVID infections and quarantines overnight. One after the other, the school doors are closing. Now, thousands of students and school staff are added to the list of people in the education system sent back into isolation, after several in Beersheba, Hadera, and Jerusalem tested positive for coronavirus. But it's not just schools that are being hit.
בימים האחרונים חלה עלייה בתחלואה ולצידה התרופפות במשמעת. אני לא יודע אם להגיד לצידה או בגללה. הנתונים עדיין לא ברורים. אנחנו מקבלים, אתמול קיבלנו כ-28 מקרים חדשים עם בדיקות יחסית נמוכות, זאת אומרת שזה מספר יותר גדול.
In a Sunday cabinet meeting, Netanyahu once again sounding the alarm, saying the deadly virus is not behind us, pleading for cooperation from the public and public figures.
כדי שנוכל לקבוע אם יש שינוי מגמה אמיתי, אנחנו נבחן בימים הקרובים את המשך הצעדים, ואם צריך, אנחנו נשנה את המדיניות בהתאם. אנחנו מבקשים מכם, אזרחי ישראל, אנחנו מבקשים משרי הממשלה, וגם מחברי הכנסת לשמש דוגמה, להקפיד על הכללים.
Announcing an even further boost in testing to some 15,000 people per day, newly appointed Health Minister Yuli Edelstein saying that the rate of positive results is now 5 times higher than several days ago, warning about the consequences of negligence.
שאו שכולנו נהיה בסדר, או שכולנו נהיה בסגר. ואני מוסיף, הרבה יותר מהר ממה שחלק מאיתנו חושבים.
The epicenter for the surge in new cases sat at the Jerusalem School of Gymnasia Rechavia over the weekend. But since Saturday, 6 other schools around the country shut their doors as cases are found in their midst. Doctors will now be allowed to direct patients to receive testing amid claims Israelis seeking the tests were being turned away or told that it would take days. Now, even those who test negative must remain in 14-day quarantine if exposed to a virus patient or displaying symptoms of COVID-19. On Sunday evening, the health ministry saying the death toll has risen to 285, with another fatality. In related news, Israel's namesake as a startup nation is at risk, with up to 65% of small businesses with 10 or fewer employees now on the chopping block, including within the high-tech sector. But Israeli government officials just can't seem to agree on how to address this growing problem. Nittany Manson reports.
In leaked remarks to Hebrew media, newly appointed Finance Minister Israel Katz coming down hard on the new Economy Minister Amir Peretz, the two disagreeing during Sunday's cabinet meeting over a newly passed coronavirus aid package. Peretz apparently arguing that the package should only benefit businesses significantly affected by the pandemic, but Katz reportedly calling for all businesses to qualify, snapping that there may be an alternative prime minister, in reference to Benny Gantz, but there is no alternative finance minister, and I decide what the policy is. Meanwhile, Israeli nonprofit organization Ogen Group has its own answer. Ogen announcing Monday that it's raised over $30 million to dish out loans and mentoring for small businesses, nonprofits, and the unemployed or furloughed workers in the country. Over 1 million Israelis have become unemployed or put on leave since the start of the pandemic, and the Ogen loans will be made available within the coming days.
Speaking of new initiatives, Prime Minister Netanyahu is looking to reimpose harsher restrictions over the coronavirus. But critics accuse the premier of using the new directives to protect himself. Well, the new Justice Minister, Avi Nissan-Cohen, is hoping to soften these new emergency rules. And here to discuss is the founder and president of the Jerusalem Washington Center, Gideon Israel. Gideon, it's a pleasure to have you back in the studio.
Good to be back.
Now, next Monday, the Knesset is to vote on the first reading of this bill. Okay, what does it actually entail?
So it's important to understand that the State of Israel inherited some of the British Mandate law, which is that the government has the right to enact emergency measures if it so desires, or if it feels that there's a need to do so. And those measures are limited to 3 months. So some of the measures that have already been enacted from January, February, and March are expiring now. And in order to renew them, the legal advisor to the Prime Minister and also the courts have said that it has to go through legislation and can't be another of what would be called an executive order, even though an executive order in Israel is when a minister as opposed to the Prime Minister gives it.
I see. All right. And so other than extending enforcement, I believe, to 10 months, there are limitations on freedom of movement, employment, protests?
Right, absolutely. There's the government can declare certain areas of limited movement, what we call in Hebrew seger. It's kind of as they closed off, for example, Bnei Brak in the past few months. They can also limit it businesses, and they can limit it freedom of assembly, and also give policemen the authority to break up those protests and to put people in jail, to give them fines. And also in the original law that was published for comments by the general population, it was that policemen would be able to enter people's house without a warrant, and that received a lot of backlash.
I see. So Avi Nissenkorn now, new Justice Minister, he's talking about reducing or softening some of these restrictions. Can you speak to that?
Avi Nissenkorn has said that people will still be able to protest, and that police will not enter regular citizens' house for no reason. Benny Gantz, who's the defense minister and also the co-prime minister, we've never had something like that. He's also said that we are not gonna throw away the concepts of civil rights. We're gonna make sure that they're protected, even though we have to enact certain things during this next period of time.
Now, certain civil rights and civil liberties, are they enshrined in Israel as they are elsewhere?
So, what exactly is the source of our rights in Israel? Some have said that basically everything is permitted except when the law says it's not. Others have said that our rights now come from basic laws such as the human respect for human rights, which was passed in 1992. What was publicized by the government says many times that everything that will be enacted in this legislation is, of course, taking into consideration this human rights law that was passed in 1992. So it would seem that even as there are emergency measures, they're using that law as sort of a basis for how to decide what they can enact and what they can't enact.
All right, well, it's going to be really interesting to see if this passes in its first readings and subsequent readings, and whether or not it's softened. Gideon, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
All right, moving on, the ripple effects of a tragic shooting in Jerusalem now becoming a tidal wave as Palestinian and Arab Israeli mourners lay Iyad Khalak to rest. Hundreds of demonstrators, enraged over the shooting death of Iyad Khalak, marching through the streets of East Jerusalem Sunday night on the way to his funeral. The 32-year-old Khalak's body draped in Palestinian flags and carried in an open casket. The procession heading for the so-called jihadist cemetery while chanting nationalist slogans against Israel and some chanting against Jews. To the streets, revolutionaries, and Khaybar, Khaybar, O Jews, Mohammed's army has begun to return. These were the cries of the crowd as it made its way down the old city's Salah ad-Din street, a reference to the 7th century battle in which Mohammed led an army to kill and expel the Jews from the town of Khaybar. But despite the chanting and the burial plot, there's no evidence that Khalak had anything to do with jihad or nationalist motives. According to initial investigations, Khalak had been killed in a tragic misunderstanding as he passed through the old city's Lion's Gate. Israeli officials vowing a full investigation and apologizing to the family.
אנחנו ממש מצטערים על המקרה שבו קרה, שבו נורה למוות איאד אל חלק, ואנחנו משתתפים בצערה של המשפחה, אבל אני בטוח שהנושא הזה יתוחקר מהר ויוסקו ממנו המסקנות.
Eilat was reportedly on his way to a special needs education center at the time of the shooting. Holding what may have been his cell phone, Israeli police allegedly believed him to be armed and called on him to stop. But Eilat's parents and caregiver explained that he suffered from an autism-like disability and that he ran away as he did not understand the orders. Finally, seeking refuge in a nearby garbage room, Eilat was shot dead. It's not yet clear if he was shot before or after entering this room. The officers involved are under house arrest while the investigation continues. Now, as protesters rally against the killing of Iyad Eilat by security forces in Jerusalem, many more around the world are joining the United States protesting the killing of George Floyd by police. Both of these deaths are tragedies in their own rights. But there are those now comparing these two incidents as one and the same. So are they? Columnist Mark Schulman joins us for more. Mark, is it fair to compare these two deaths?
Well, you can compare, but they're not the same. I mean, the reality is, in both cases, a situation took place where you have people who we act a little bit differently towards. In that sense, there's a comparison. However, in the case of the killing in East Jerusalem, that was a 1-second decision, a wrong decision, a terrible decision, but it wasn't something that was thought about. He didn't try for 6 minutes or 9 minutes to kill him as he's calling for his mother, et cetera, et cetera. It was a tragic mistake. It may have come from a certain level of prejudice, but the prejudice that we have is a result of 40 years, 100 years of conflict. And so the reality is that a lot of Israelis are afraid of Arabs in East Jerusalem or other places, not because they think they're bad people, but because they're afraid, because, let's put it this way, 99.9% of Arabs in East Jerusalem and the West Bank are not terrorists, but almost 100% of the terrorists are Arabs from the East, from Gaza or the West Bank. So there's a certain fear factor. We can't compare it. Look, in Minneapolis, Floyd, the maximum he did was he used a $20 counterfeit. He didn't do any violence. He wasn't accused of murder. Nothing. He might have used a $20 counterfeit bill to pay for something. That is not a sentence for murder. And therefore, it really is not fair to compare the two. It's a completely different affair. But we have to keep in mind that, yes, there's always a certain level of prejudice amongst all of us. And in different ways, it shows in different sort of fears.
So where do these comparisons come from? Because we're seeing a lot of, intersectionalism saying, showing that certain police forces will train with the IDF and therefore they draw a parallel there. Where are these comparisons
Okay,
from?
so first of all, look, the far left has a term, the intersectionality, that if you're for feminism, you have to be for Palestinian rights, for black rights, it's all one thing. But obviously, it's not all one thing. There's great differences. And once again, people forget the fact that we've had a national conflict with the Palestinians for 100 years. It didn't just come up yesterday. The fact of the matter is that so far we've won that conflict, so that makes us the oppressor, quote unquote. But that's not the reality. Does it mean we're always right? Of course we're not always right. Does it mean it's good to occupy people? It's not always good to occupy people. But there is a view on the far left that you have to compare the two, and anything that Israel does is bad, and it therefore it must be the same thing. It must be the same terrible people who are doing the same things, whether it's to African Americans in the United States or to Palestinians in Israel or to women. It's all the same sort of thing. And that's a terrible, terrible comparison. And you cannot put all these things into one grouping. But there is an attempt on the far left to do that, and we need to fight that without a doubt.
So what are the outcomes of this intersectionality or of drawing these comparisons?
Well, the outcomes certainly work against us in the sense that people sort of think,
Are they intended to?
Yes, they're clearly intended to. There's no question they're intended to work against us. There's no question that certain people who are particularly antagonistic to us are trying to use it to increase hatred of Israel and say, look, Israel's just like these policemen or just like whatever it might be. And yes, it's very intentional. And it's something we have to really be worried about. Now, look, it doesn't help the fact that our government is tied very strongly and identifies with President Trump, and President Trump here is considered by many the evil incarnate in all of what's going on. So that does not help the situation and makes it worse, obviously. But we can't allow that comparison to be accepted. We have to understand, look, we make mistakes. And there is no question in my mind that after all these years of occupation, it's bad for us. We do bad things when you occupy people for so long. But we don't do bad things because we really want to. We do bad things, we make mistakes, and because we're afraid. And we don't hate Palestinians in the same way that some people hate African Americans. And we don't have the prejudice on that level. And I think we have to make sure that people understand that.
All right, Mark, I hate to bring you on such a terrible circumstances, but thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Turning now to annexations, you may recall that Israel plans to put the move up for a vote as soon as July 1st. And the Palestinian Authority is threatening to end all cooperations and agreements with Israel in protest. But cutting off all partnerships may carry some major unintended consequences. Big words from Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas backfiring at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. The ICC now giving Abbas, commonly known as Abu Mazen, just 10 days to clarify his recent statements. And depending on his answer, he'll either look weak before his constituents or lose his case with the court, along with any Palestinian claims to the region. The ICC is currently weighing whether it has jurisdiction to open investigations into alleged Israeli war crimes or not. And ICC Chief Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda is saying they do have jurisdiction, while the rest of the judges have until June 14th to give their final answer. But ahead of their deadline, PA President Abbas threw in a monkey wrench. In a response to Israeli plans to annex parts of Judea and Samaria or the West Bank and Jordan Valley, Abbas is saying that he will terminate all agreements with Israel, including the Oslo Accords. But the 1993 Oslo Accords form the basis on which the Palestinian Authority exists. And if there is no sovereign Palestinian Authority, then the PA cannot bring its case before the court. So now the ICC has given Abu Mazen a deadline, putting Abbas between a rock and a hard place. Either he continues to operate under Oslo, in spite of his threats and Israeli annexation plans, or he dissolves the Palestinian Authority and any of its legal arguments against Jerusalem. Heading back to the coronavirus now, asylum seekers in Israel have been acutely affected by the shutdowns. Their mental and societal stresses from before the pandemic exacerbated to unbearable heights. But the Moments of Refuge project and Haifa University have now paired up to address these stressors with Mindfulness SOS. It's an online adaptation of mindfulness-based trauma recovery for refugees. And here to tell us more about it is Israeli psychologist Dr. Camila Folkash-Lavan. Doctor, thank you so much for being with us. Now, what do you know about mindfulness?
Thank you for having me. So mindfulness is a technique that's really, really important and very powerful, and it's used in many different therapeutic modalities. The idea is to teach the brain, basically, there are many levels, but teach the brain to kind of catch the moment, to relax, to rest, to rejuvenate itself. Yes, so basically it's a meditation technique, but it's more. There's more things built around it as well.
It sounds like it promotes maybe self-awareness and self-control. Is that accurate?
Exactly. That's exactly what it does. And one of the problems, for example, difficulties in stress-related or anxiety-related PTSD, depression, different kinds of illnesses, is that the mind basically runs away and it gets overwhelmed with flashbacks, emotions, different kind of stressful situations that might not even exist in the right now, but came from before.
And so how does this in particular benefit the asylum-seeking community?
So it's a technique for everyone because we all go through different kinds of stresses. And if you have a way to just check out a little bit or have a little vacation for yourself during the day, it's a wonderful thing. And also that means that your nervous system, instead of being heightened right here, the baseline is somewhere here. So even if something happens that's stressful, even the jump will not be nearly as high as it is if you're already on high, yes? Mm-hmm. So especially for asylum seekers, this is really, really useful because during asylum, immigration in general, but during asylum especially, there is a lot of unknown. There's a lot of stresses. Work permits often aren't there. Jobs aren't there. Language is lacking. Families are often torn apart. I worked for years in the field with torture victims, for example, and many of them are asylum seekers, and a lot of them don't even know where their family members are or if they're even still alive. There is poverty. There is difficulty with finding food, with basics. So the situation is so stressful. Like, how do you cope? How do you stay safe?
All right. Well, I want to thank you, first of all, for explaining that to everybody and to everyone watching at home. You can learn more about this project and mindfulness at momentsofrefuge.com. Camila, thank you so much for joining us. In other news, move over New Year's Eve because COVID-19 is the new resolution starter, inspiring thousands of Israelis to finally ditch their addictions to nicotine. Now, even with a pandemic, there seems to be a silver lining, as more than 51% of Israeli smokers aged 18 to 24 are now seriously considering quitting. And at the very least, nearly half of all Israeli smokers are also reportedly smoking less than usual. This, according to the Israel Cancer Association on Sunday, as the world marks International No Tobacco Day, where the World Health Organization focuses on protecting teens and young adults from the tobacco industry's marketing and manipulations. But it's not just marketing and manipulations that has Israelis giving up their cigarettes. Continually rising prices and now the coronavirus are mainly to blame. Habitual smoking is a main source of comorbidity with the virus, which heavily affects victims' breathing. And already at least 80,000 Israelis have died in the last decade from smoking-related illnesses. That's over 8,000 deaths per year, or 22 deaths in Israel alone every single day. As for allegations that smokers are actually less likely to contract COVID-19, deeper studies suggest that these reports are based on faulty logic. Still, all that said, the study also finds that nearly a third of Arab Israelis and 8% of Israeli Jews reported a family member starting to smoke amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this next story is giving us all reason to be proud. LGBT Pride Month begins today, and in Israel, this includes typically parades, demonstrations, and events in celebration of the LGBTQ+ community. But now, this massive message of support and tolerance is targeting a younger audience in a landmark book. Nittany Manson has the details.
Pride Month is a time to be proud. Proud of who you are and proud of the people you love, no matter their identity or sexual orientation. But you don't have to be an adult to tackle this big adult theme. And an all-new children's book is now helping the next generation understand the struggle. Released on the 50th anniversary of Pride, the book A Day of Pride gives kids just a small taste of what LGBTQ parents and couples face. And it's the first ever book of its kind in Hebrew. Author Ro'i Yildiz Rice explains that the book was written shortly after first marching in Pride with his daughters, where he learned of thousands of children born to other proud families in recent years. Yet there are no children's books on the subject in Hebrew. Until now. But Yildiz Rice further explains that the book is not intended to convert or confuse anyone. Rather, it's to encourage an open discussion on equality and tolerance. This gorgeous and colorful book, illustrated by Yossi Madar, is now available for purchase at adayofpride.co.il.
Now moving south to the city of Eilat, the typically luscious coral reefs off of the Eilat coasts are hurting bad. According to a new survey by the Environmental Protection Ministry, up to 75% of the reefs have been severely damaged by recent storms. Just 2 months ago, a series of unseasonable storms flashed past the Middle East, wreaking havoc in its wake. Infrastructure on and around the beaches in Eilat all sustaining enormous damages. And the coral reefs, some as deep as 10 meters underwater, were not spared. The Environmental Protection Ministry explaining that in the past, such mortality events were mainly caused by extremely low tides and exposure of the coral to the air. But a coral death of this magnitude has never been recorded in Eilat ever, where the reefs are thought to be unusually resistant to global warming. So where are the damages from? Well, early results find that most were caused by the breaking of large coral colonies in the waves and then the covering of those colonies with sand. But now for the good news, thanks to a 2019 initiative to remove waste from the Gulf of Eilat, the damages could have been much worse. And Environmental Protection Minister Gila Gamliel is promising to do everything in her power to restore the reefs without disruption. On that note, let's take a look at the weather forecast. Tonight, the warm weather continues with a low of about 68 or 20 degrees Celsius. Then tomorrow, you can expect mostly clear and sunny skies and a rise in temperatures for a high of 88 degrees Fahrenheit or 31 Celsius. And now, before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. We can see here people not protesting to block the streets, but blocking the streets to help a family of ducks cross the road. Amazing. All right. That's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.51 shekels to the American dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and Roku TV pages. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.